The gusher has stopped, but we still don't know exactly what set off the biggest offshore oil spill in history. Investigations continue, and critical revelations about the BP disaster are coming from one of the last crewmen to escape the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig. Mike Williams first told his story on 60 Minutes in May. Since that broadcast, he's become a key witness in the federal investigation. Williams says the blowout was the result of a series of mishaps that started weeks before. The night of the disaster, he was in his workshop when the engines that powered the rig's generators began to run wild. It was the first sign that explosive gas was enveloping the Deepwater Horizon.
I hear the engines revving. The lights are glowing. I'm hearing the alarms. I mean, they're at a constant state now. It's just beep, 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 beep. It doesn't stop. But even that's starting to get drowned out by the sound of the engine increasing in speed. And my lights get so incredibly bright that they physically explode. I'm pushing my way back from the desk when my computer monitor exploded.
This is the Deepwater Horizon in the hours before its destruction, the night of April 20th. Ironically, the end was coming only months after the rig's greatest achievement. Mike Williams was the chief electronics technician in charge of the rig's computers and electrical systems, and 7 months before, he'd helped the crew drill the deepest oil well in history, 35,000 feet.
It was special. There's no way around it. Everyone was talking about it. The congratulations that were flowing around, it made you feel proud to work there.
Williams worked for the owner, Transocean, the largest offshore drilling company. Like its sister rigs, the Deepwater Horizon cost $350 million, rose 378 feet from bottom to top, both advanced and safe. None of her 126 crew had been seriously injured in 7 years.
Go, go, go!
The safety record was remarkable because offshore drilling today pushes technology with challenges matched only by the space program. Deepwater Horizon was in 5,000 feet of water and would drill another 13,000 feet, a total of 3.5 miles. The oil and gas down there are under enormous pressure, and the key to keeping that pressure under control is this fluid that drillers call mud. Mud is a man-made drilling fluid that's pumped down the well and back up the sides in continuous circulation. The sheer weight of this fluid keeps the oil and gas down and the well under control.
Come on, come on!
The tension in every drilling operation is between doing things safely and doing them fast.
Get out of the way!
Time is money, and this job was costing BP $1 million a day. But Williams says there was trouble from the start. Getting to the oil was taking too long.
How long did you expect it to take?
We were told 21 days.
How long did it actually take?
We were at 6 weeks.
With the schedule slipping, Williams says a BP manager ordered a faster pace.
And he requested to the driller, hey, let's bump it up, let's bump it up. And what he was talking about there is he's bumping up the rate of penetration, how fast the drill bit is going down.
Williams says going faster caused the bottom of the well to split open, swallowing tools and the drilling fluid called mud.
We actually got stuck. And we got stuck so bad that we had to send tools down into the drill pipe and sever the pipe.
That well was abandoned. Deepwater Horizon had to drill a new route to the oil. It cost BP more than 2 weeks and millions of dollars.
We were informed of this during one of the safety meetings that somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 million was lost in bottom hole assembly and mud. And you always kind of knew that in the back of your mind when they start throwing these big numbers around, that there was going to be a push coming, you know, a push to pick up production, pick up the pace.
There was pressure on the crew after this happened?
There's always pressure, but yes, the pressure was increased.
But the trouble was just beginning. When drilling resumed, Williams says there was an accident on the rig that has not been reported before. He says 4 weeks before the explosion, the rig's most vital piece of safety equipment was damaged. Down near the seabed is the blowout preventer, or BOP. It's used to seal the well shut in order to test the pressure and integrity of the well, and in case of a blowout, it's the crew's only hope. A key component is a rubber gasket at the top called an annular, which can close tightly around the drill pipe. Williams says that during a test they closed the gasket, but while it was shut tight, a crewman on deck accidentally nudged a joystick, applying hundreds of thousands of pounds of force and moving 15 feet of drill pipe through the closed blowout preventer. Later, a man monitoring drilling fluid rising to the top made a troubling find.
He discovered chunks of rubber in the drilling fluid. He thought it was important enough to gather this double handful of chunks of rubber and bring them into the driller shack. I recall asking the supervisor if this was out of the ordinary. He said, "Oh, it's no big deal." And I thought, how can it be not a big deal? There's chunks of our seal is now missing.
And Williams says he knew about another problem with the blowout preventer. The BOP is operated from the surface by wires connected to two control pods. One is a backup. Williams says that one of the pods lost some of its function weeks before. Transocean tells us the BOP was tested by remote control after these incidents and passed, but nearly a mile below there was no way to know how much damage there was or why the pod seemed unreliable. In the hours before the disaster, Deepwater Horizon's work was nearly done. All that was left was to seal the well closed. The oil would be pumped out by another rig later. Williams says that during a safety meeting, the manager for the rig owner, Transocean, was explaining how they were going to close the well when the manager from BP interrupted.
I had the BP company man sitting directly beside me, and he literally perked up and said, "Well, my process is different, and I think we're going to do it this way." And they kind of lined out the way he thought it should go that day. So there was sort of a chest bumping kind of deal. The communication seemed to really break down as to who was ultimately in charge.
The day of the accident, BP flew several managers to the Deepwater Horizon for a ceremony to congratulate the crew for 7 years without an injury. While they were there, a surge of explosive gas came flying up the well from 3 miles below. The rig's diesel engines, which power its electric generators, sucked in the gas and began to run wild.
I'm hearing hissing, the engines are over revving, and then all of a sudden all the lights in my shop just started getting brighter and brighter and brighter. And I knew then something bad was getting ready to happen.
It was almost 10 at night, and directly under the Deepwater Horizon were 4 men in a fishing boat: Albert Andre, Dustin King, Ryan Chasen, and Wesley Borg.
When I heard the gas coming out, I knew exactly what it was almost immediately.
When the gas cloud was descending on you, what was that like?
It was scary. And when I looked at it, it burned my eyes, and I knew we had to get out of there.
You could tell what it was.
I knew it was methane.
On the rig, Mike Williams was reaching for a door to investigate the engine noise.
These are 3-inch thick steel fire-rated doors with 6 stainless steel hinges supporting them on the frame. As I reached for the handle, I heard this awful hissing noise, this whoosh, and at the height of the hiss, a huge explosion. The explosion literally rips the door from the hinges. Impacts me and takes me to the other side of the shop. And I'm up against the wall when I finally come around with a door on top of me. And I remember thinking to myself, this is it. I'm gonna die right here.
The men on the fishing boat had a camera.
Look at the water on fire.
I began to crawl across the floor. As I got to the next door, it exploded and took me, the door, and slid me about 35 feet backwards again and planted me up against another wall. At that point, I actually got angry. I was mad at the doors. I was mad that these fire doors that are supposed to protect me are hurting me. And at that point, I made a decision. I'm going to get outside. I may die out there, but I'm gonna get outside. So I crawl across the grid work of the floor and make my way to that opening where I see the light. I made it out the door, and I thought to myself, I've accomplished what I set out to accomplish. I made it outside. At least now I can breathe. I may die out here, but I can breathe.
Williams couldn't see. Something was pouring into his eyes, and that's when he noticed a gash on his forehead.
I didn't know if it was blood. I didn't know if it was brains. I didn't know if it was flesh. I didn't know what it was. I just knew I was in trouble. At that point, I grabbed a life jacket. I was on the aft lifeboat deck. There were 2 functioning lifeboats at my disposal right there. But I knew I couldn't board them. I had responsibilities.
His responsibility was to report to the bridge, the rig's command center.
I'm hearing alarms. I'm hearing radio chatter, mayday, mayday, mayday. We've lost propulsion. We've lost power. We have a fire. Man overboard on the starboard forward deck.
Multiple personnel on water. Any person in the vicinity help will be really appreciated.
Williams says that on the bridge, he watched them try to activate emergency systems.
The BOP that was supposed to protect us and keep us from the blowout obviously had failed, and now the emergency disconnect to get us away from this fuel source has failed. We have no communications to the BOP.
Situation around, fire in the water, people jumping in the water, and shipping life rafts.
And I see one of the lifeboats in the water, and it's motoring away from the vessel. I looked at the captain and asked him, I said, what's going on? He said, I've given the order to abandon ship.
Every Sunday, they had practice lifeboat drills and the procedure for making sure that everyone was accounted for. But in the panic, all that went to hell. The lifeboats were leaving.
They're leaving without you?
They have left without the captain and without knowing that they had everyone that had survived all this on board. I've been left now by 2 lifeboats. And I look at the captain and I said, what do we do now? By now, the fire is not only on the derrick, it's starting to spread to the deck. At that point, there were several more explosions, large, intense explosions.
What do they feel like, sound like?
It just take your breath away type explosions, shake your body to the core explosions. Take your vision away from the percussion of the explosion.
About 8 survivors were left on the rig, including Williams, the captain, and a crewwoman named Andrea.
I remember looking at Andrea and seeing that look in her eyes of she had quit, she had given up. I remember her saying, I'm scared. And I said, it's okay to be scared, I'm scared too. She said, what are we gonna do? I said, we're gonna burn up or we're gonna jump.
How far is it to the sea?
Maybe 90 feet, 100 feet. It's a long ways.
In the middle of the night, with blood in his eyes, fire at his back, and the sea 10 stories below, Williams made his choice.
I remember closing my eyes and saying a prayer and asking God to tell my wife, little girl, that Daddy did everything he could. And if I survive this, it's for a reason. I made those 3 steps, and I pushed off the end of the rig. And I fell for what seemed like forever. A lot of things go through your mind.
The rest of Mike Williams' story and a look at the company responsible for the disaster when we come back. Wearing a life jacket, Mike Williams, the chief electronics technician aboard the Deepwater Horizon, jumped feet first off the deck and away from the inferno. He had witnessed key events before the disaster, but if he was going to tell anyone, he would have to survive a 10-story drop into the sea.
I went down way below the surface, obviously. And when I popped back up, I felt like, okay, I've made it. But I feel this god-awful burning all over me. And I'm thinking, am I on fire? You know, I just don't know. So I start doing the only thing I know to do, swim. I gotta get away from this thing. I could tell I was floating in oil and grease and diesel fuel. I mean, it just the smell. And I remember looking under the rig and seeing the water on fire. And I thought, what have you done? You were dry and you weren't covered in oil up there. Now you've jumped and you've made this and you've landed in oil. The fire's gonna come across the water and you're gonna burn up. And I thought, that you just gotta swim harder. So I swam and I kicked and I swam and I kicked and I swam as hard as I could until I remember not feeling any more pain. And I didn't hear anything. And I thought, well, I must have burned up because I don't feel anything, I don't hear anything, I don't smell anything. I must be dead. Then I remember a real faint voice of, over here, and I thought, what in the world is that? And the next thing I know, he grabbed my life jacket and flipped me over into this small open-bowed boat. I didn't know who he was, I didn't know where he'd come from, I didn't care. I was now out of the water.
His crewmate, Andrea, had jumped into a life raft dangling from the rig and then jumped into the water.
And the next person we picked up was the girl. She was alive.
The captain also survived a leap into the sea.
And as the boat's pulling away, you look at Deepwater Horizon, and what do you see?
She's on fire, bad fire. I think about who else may be on there.
William's survival may be critical to the investigation. We took William's story to Dr. Bob B., a professor of engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, and a former chief engineer of Shell Oil. The White House has asked B. to help analyze the Deepwater Horizon accident. B. investigated the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster for NASA and the Hurricane Katrina disaster for the National Science Foundation. B's voice never completely recovered from the weeks he spent in the flood in New Orleans, but as the White House has found, he's among the nation's best. He's investigated more than 20 offshore rig disasters.
Mr. Williams comes forward with these very detailed elements from his viewpoints on the rig. That's a brave and intelligent man.
What he's saying is very important to this investigation, you believe?
It is.
What strikes Professor B. is Mike Williams' description of the blowout preventer. Williams says that in a drilling accident 4 weeks before the explosion, the critical rubber gasket called an annular was damaged and pieces of it started coming out of the well.
According to Williams, when parts of the annular start coming up onto the deck, someone from Transocean says, look, don't worry about it. What does that tell you?
Houston, I think we have a problem.
Here's why that's so important. The annular is used to seal the well for pressure tests, and those tests determine whether dangerous gas is seeping in.
So if the annular is damaged, if I understand you correctly, you can't do the pressure tests in a reliable way.
That's correct. You may get pressure test recordings, but because you're leaking pressure, they're not reliable.
Mike Williams also told us that a backup control system to the blowout preventer called a pod had lost some of its functions.
What is the standard operating procedure if you lose one of the control pods on the BOP?
Reestablish it, fix it. It's like losing one of your legs.
The morning of the disaster, according to Williams, there was an argument in front of all of the men on the shift between the Transocean manager and the BP manager. Do you know what that argument was about?
Yes.
What was it?
Who's boss?
In finishing the well, the plan was to have a subcontractor, Halliburton, place 3 concrete plugs, like corks, in the column. The Transocean manager wanted to do this with the column full of heavy drilling fluid, what drillers call mud, to keep the pressure down below contained. But the BP manager wanted to begin to remove the mud before the last plug was set. That would reduce the pressure controlling the well before the plugs were finished.
Why would BP want to do that?
It expedites the subsequent steps.
It's a matter of going faster.
Faster, sure.
Who won the argument?
BP.
If the mud had been left in the column, would there have been a blowout?
It doesn't look like it.
To do it BP's way, They had to be absolutely certain that the first two plugs were keeping the pressure down. That life or death test was done using the blowout preventer, which had the damaged gasket. Investigators have also found that the BOP had a hydraulic leak and a weak battery.
Weeks before the disaster, they know that they are drilling into a very dangerous formation. The formation has told them that.
That's correct.
And has cost them millions of dollars.
That's correct.
And they know the BOP is broken.
Correct.
Broken in a number of ways.
Correct.
What is the appropriate thing to do at that point?
I express it to my students this way. It's stop, think, don't do something stupid.
They didn't stop. As the drilling fluid was removed, relieving the downward pressure, the plugs failed. The blowout preventer didn't work, and 11 men were incinerated. 115 crew members survived. 2 days later, the Deepwater Horizon sank to the bottom. This was just the latest disaster for a company that is the largest oil producer in the United States. BP, once known as British Petroleum, was found willfully negligent in a 2005 Texas refinery explosion that killed 15 of its workers. BP was hit with $108 million in fines, the highest workplace safety fines in U.S. history. Now, we have found there is new concern about another BP facility in the Gulf. A former BP insider tells us this platform, called Atlantis, is a greater threat than the Deepwater Horizon. Ken Abbott has worked for Shell and GE, and in 2008 he was hired by BP to manage thousands of engineering drawings for the Atlantis platform.
They serve as blueprints and also as an operator manual, if you will, on how to make this thing work and, more importantly, how to shut it down in an emergency.
But Abbott says that he found that 89% of those critical drawings had not been inspected and approved by BP engineers. Even worse, he says 95% of the underwater welding plans had never been approved either.
Are these welding procedures supposed to be approved in the paperwork before the welds are done?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So they're
critical.
Critical.
Abbott's charges are backed up by BP internal emails. In 2008, BP manager Barry Duff wrote that the lack of approved drawings could result in catastrophic operator errors. And currently, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of subsea documents that have never been finalized. Duff called the practice fundamentally wrong.
I've never seen this kind of attitude where, safety doesn't seem to matter, and when you complain of a problem like Barry did and like I did and try to fix it, you're just criticized and pushed aside.
Ken Abbott was laid off. He took his concerns to a consumer advocacy group called Food and Water Watch. They're asking Congress to investigate.
The Atlantis is still pumping away out there, 200,000 barrels a day, and it'll be 4 times that in a year or two when they put in all 16 wells. I mean, if something happens there, it'll make the Deepwater Horizon look like a bubble in the water by comparison.
In an email, BP told us the Atlantis crew had all the documents it needs to run the platform safely. We also wanted BP's perspective on the Deepwater Horizon disaster. The company scheduled an interview with its CEO, Tony Hayward, and then they canceled, saying no one at BP could sit down with 60 Minutes for this report. In other interviews, Hayward has said this about Transocean, the owner of the Deepwater Horizon.
The responsibility for safety on the drilling rig is with Transocean. It is their rig, their equipment, their people, their systems, their safety processes.
When BP's Chief Executive Officer, Tony Hayward, says that this is Transocean's accident, what do you say?
I get sick. This kind of division in the industry is a killer. The industry is comprised of many organizations, and they all share the responsibility for successful operations. And to start placing, we'll call it these barriers, and pointing fingers at each other is totally destructive.
But who's responsible?
BP.
In early May, we went out to the Gulf and found mats of thick, floating oil. All told, about 5 million barrels of oil spewed into the Gulf, the largest offshore spill in history. BP has spent $6 billion on cleanup and compensation, but consider that's the same amount that the company made in profits in just the first 3 months of this year. There are plenty of accusations to go around that BP pressed for speed, Halliburton's cement plugs failed, and Transocean damaged the blowout preventer. Through all the red flags, they pressed ahead. It was, after all, the Deepwater Horizon, the world record holder, celebrated as among the safest in the fleet.
Men lost their lives. I don't know how else to say it. All the things that they told us could never happen, happened.
Ten years ago, the Exxon Valdez, a supertanker carrying 53 million gallons of crude oil, ran aground in the pristine waters of Alaska's Prince William Sound. It was the worst environmental disaster in United States history, killing more wildlife than any other previous catastrophe. On top of that, some 60,000 Alaskans, most involved in fishing, say the oil spill hurt their lives and livelihood. The disaster cost Exxon $3.5 billion, much of which went towards a massive cleanup effort. And if you talk to Exxon officials these days, they'll tell you that Prince William Sound has recovered and that everyone hurt by the spill has been compensated. But if you go back to the Sound, as we did last month, and talk to the people who live there, you'll hear another story altogether. This is the beach at Sleepy Bay, about 65 miles downwind from where the Exxon Valdez ran aground. Take a look at all of this and you get a sense of the pristine beauty that is Alaska. But turn over a rock on this beach and you're likely to find oil. And government scientists say that that oil from the spill is as toxic today as it was 10 years ago. So that's the oil right there.
That's the oil. That's leaking up from underneath. And that's toxic stuff. So it's like a little toxic landmine.
Bruce Wright heads a task force looking into the Exxon Valdez oil spill for the National Marine Fisheries Service, a federal agency. You sure this is Exxon Valdez oil?
It's Exxon Valdez oil. There's no question about that.
Wow.
You see, that's all tarry oil. And you can smell that.
Oh, yeah.
So you don't want to smell it too much because it's real volatile still. And this whole expanse of beach is covered with this stuff.
This isn't the only place you'll find it here?
You'll find oil on lots of beaches in Prince William Sound.
The oil we were shown at Sleepy Bay spilled into Prince William Sound March 24th, 1989, just after midnight when the Exxon Valdez, a ship the size of 3 football fields, ran aground on a reef, even though the reef was plainly marked on charts in the wheelhouse. Eventually, oil from the tanker's ruptured hull spread over 1,300 miles of Alaskan coastline. The death toll was staggering. 250,000 seabirds, 3,000 otters, hundreds of bald eagles. And despite Exxon's attempts to clean up the mess, government scientists say oil from the spill continues to take a toll on marine life in Prince William Sound.
The fish on the left is a normal pink salmon, and the fish on the right is a pink salmon that's been exposed to low levels of Exxon Valdez oil.
So that bulging is a result of the oil spill?
That bulging is the result of exposure to oil, yes. Usually leads to death of the fish early on.
And are there salmon that look like this in Prince William Sound today?
You could go out and find salmon that look like this in the oiled part of Prince William Sound.
However, Exxon officials continue to insist that oil from the spill is not responsible for long-term damage to marine life in Prince William Sound. And they say that the vast majority of species were never affected by the spill or have fully recovered. But according to a government report released last month, 21 out of 23 species have yet to recover. And while government scientists say they cannot prove it, many local fishermen argue that the spill is to blame for the current shortage of certain fish in Prince William Sound.
We used to have 275 boats that fished in the fishery every year out in the Sound, and now you've got about 90 to 100 boats that participate. I mean, half the fleet's gone bankrupt.
These fishermen from Cordova, Alaska say that lingering effects from the oil spill have caused a sharp decline in herring. Herring that were once abundant and provided a good living for Ross Mullins, who has fished in Prince William Sound for the last 35 years.
When we're out here on the water, this really looks pretty nice.
Yeah, it is. It's nice. I mean, it looks nice, but there's a big difference. And the fish that don't show up, how are you going to look out there and see, those fish didn't show up, you know?
And when you hear Exxon say that we've spent a couple $2 billion on this cleanup?
They've spent the money. They came in here and they put thousands of people on the beach cleaning up rocks and that sort of thing, but there's still oil out there.
Sylvia Lang, who's been fishing commercially since she was a teenager, says the shortage of fish since the spill has caused the value of their state-issued fishing permits to plummet.
A permit cost $300,000 in 1988 because you could probably gross that in 1988. It's worth $27,000 now because you're lucky if you get that now.
And the depreciation in the value of that permit, you attribute directly to the oil spill?
Without a doubt.
These fishermen got hammered, and they're still getting hammered.
Brian O'Neill is the lead attorney representing the Cordova fishermen and tens of thousands of other Alaskans in a civil suit against Exxon and Captain Joseph Hazelwood, who was the skipper of the oil tanker when it ran aground. In 1994, a jury determined that both Exxon and Captain Hazelwood had acted recklessly.
The general public, what I can see, perceives me as some drunken fool.
After the spill, Hazelwood, who now works as a clerk in the Manhattan law firm that represents him, was accused of being intoxicated and not at the helm of the tanker when it ran aground.
A simple question. Were you intoxicated that night?
No.
You did have some drinks before the ship left port, though?
Yes.
How much did you have to drink?
3 drinks, and possibly a sip of the 4th.
Perhaps a 4th sip of what?
Vodka on the
Vodka.
rocks.
Your license to drive a car was suspended at the time of the grounding. That was because of a drunk driving conviction?
Yes, from 6 months prior to that.
It seems a little incongruous that you can't drive a car at home, but you can pilot a tanker.
Well, the Coast Guard took no exception with it, and it was something that occurred in my personal life. It had nothing to do with my job.
Hazelwood was acquitted in a 1990 criminal trial of having been intoxicated while piloting the Exxon Valdez. A blood test that initially indicated he was drunk turned out to have been mishandled. He insists the grounding of the supertanker was the result of a simple mistake.
You're on the way.
Okay, thank you.
To see just what that mistake was, we took Captain Hazelwood to this simulator which is used to train ship captains. Programmed into the simulator was this view from the bridge of the Exxon Valdez 10 minutes before it ran aground. The tanker was heading for a reef marked by a blinking light on the horizon, which we highlighted. Hazelwood says he left the ship's third mate with instructions to make a right turn away from the reef when the tanker was abreast of what he says that night was a clearly visible landmark.
So all you have to do is get even with that.
This light here that's coming up.
And you make a right turn.
Yep.
The third mate, who was granted immunity from prosecution, admitted he failed to execute the right turn, which had been ordered. At the time, Captain Hazelwood was in his cabin doing paperwork.
When did you realize something was wrong?
The phone rang, and as I picked up the receiver, he said, I think we're in trouble. And at that moment, I felt a shudder, and I got sick to my stomach.
Physically sick?
Physically sick.
Because you knew?
Well, I don't know if it was panic or terror. I knew something was dreadfully wrong then.
And when could you actually see that something was dreadfully wrong?
Well, as I walked out and came over and I could see the oil boiling up to the surface of the water.
Do you personally think that you made any mistakes that night?
Well, in retrospect, and hindsight being 20/20, of course, I never would have left the bridge if I had any idea that what was going to happen.
If you had remained on the bridge that night, do you think
Yes.
the ship would have run aground?
I don't think so. I can't perceive me missing that turn.
Captain Hazelwood will be heading back to Alaska this summer to begin 1,000 hours of court-ordered community service. His assignment is to pick up trash from state highways and parks. As for Exxon, the jury that found the company had acted recklessly ordered it to pay $5 billion in punitive damages to the fishermen and others who say they were hurt by the spill.
It's been 5 years since you won that judgment. How much of the $5 billion has Exxon paid?
None of it.
Nothing?
Not a cent.
Why?
They have spent most of the last 5 years filing motion after motion to get the judgment overturned.
In all, Exxon filed more than 25 motions, prompting the federal judge overseeing the trial to express concern that the company will devise any possible procedural roadblock to defer payment of the judgment. The judge also expressed disappointment with Exxon's legal tactics, writing at one point, Exxon has acted as a Jekyll and Hyde, behaving laudably in public and deplorably in private. Exxon is appealing the case to a higher court.
The judgment earns interest at about 6%, and Exxon makes about 18% on money that it invests. So by not paying, Exxon makes money. In fact, it makes so much money that by not paying, the interest in about 6.5 years will pay the judgment.
How do you respond to those who say that you and your clients are going after Exxon because they are such a wealthy company?
My clients and I sued Exxon because Exxon promised it would safely transit Prince William Sound with oil, and Exxon made a fortune off of that oil, and Exxon didn't live up to its responsibilities and spill that oil and ruin an awful lot of people's lives.
Although oil from the Exxon Valdez never actually reached Cordova, people who live here say it was a disaster that devastated this little town. Before the spill, Cordova had been among the top 10 fishing ports in the United States. 5 years later, it had dropped to number 60. And social scientists who came here after the spill found significantly higher rates of alcohol abuse and depression. A former mayor committed suicide, leaving behind a note that blamed in part stress caused by the spill.
Everything has taken an impact from that 1989 spill.
You still feel it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Jack Hopkins says in 1989, Exxon pledged to make fishermen whole. The company did distribute $25 million in Cordova that year. But he says the $60,000 he got has been nowhere near enough to cover his business losses and make him whole.
I think what I am is in the hole. You know, I'm having a hard time making boat payments and.
But isn't fishing cyclical? I mean, don't you have down years and up years?
Oh, yeah, you do. But cycles are one thing. Total failures are another. And in these years of failures, you had Southeast Alaska, booming, biggest runs in history. You had to the west, you had strong runs. And here we had failures.
Exxon told us, and I'm quoting, those directly impacted by the spill were immediately and fully compensated.
That's total BS. I mean, that's bogus.
Exxon declined our requests for an on-camera interview, but the company did send us this letter, which says in part, the oil spill was a tragic accident which we deeply regret. We are appealing the $5 billion punitive damage verdict because we believe it is unjust and excessive.
They see themselves as a company that's already spent $3.5 billion on the oil spill. Why is there need for more punishment, more money?
When you and I do something that the law says we must be punished for it, it's got to hurt. And they're not hurting. Their stock has tripled since 1989. Where is the hurt? Here's the hurt. The hurt is here in this little community that has lost its sense of future. We have the hurt. I don't see where Exxon has the hurt.
The hurricanes keep coming with increased force and increased frequency. Even before hitting land, they're often wreaking havoc. Katrina, Sandy, Ida, name a tropical storm, and odds are good it's caused an offshore oil spill. And these messes aren't easily cleaned up. Tonight, we bring you a distinctly Louisiana story, one we first reported last November. The saga of the Taylor Energy oil spill, a storm-caused environmental crisis that sullied the Gulf of Mexico since 2004. Then along came an unlikely duo, a no-nonsense Coast Guard captain who said enough is enough, and a homegrown Cajun engineer who brought with him the power of local knowledge. Together, they would resist a deep-pocketed energy company and help stanch the longest-running oil spill in U.S. history.
How many miles offshore are we now? We're about 12 miles offshore from the coast of Louisiana.
A seventh-generation Cajun, Timmy Cuvion, grew up on the Louisiana Delta, where river mingles with sea. Even as an engineering student, he moonlighted as a fishing captain.
I've caught, 150-pound tunas this close.
He showed us the precise site of a groundbreaking contraption that's consumed him lately.
We're right above it now, aren't we? Yes, sir. The Taylor Energy platform will be laying on its side just below us.
His engineering company has conceived of and installed a system to help contain a stubborn oil spill. It's directly below this spot, nearly 500 feet underwater.
If we didn't have GPS coordinates, we wouldn't know that we had a functioning system that was actively collecting 1,000 gallons of oil a day.
Catch that? An average of 1,000 gallons of oil a day that would otherwise be contaminating the Gulf of Mexico. It's being captured by Timmy Cuvion's system and transferred to these tanks to be sold later as recycled oil.
100,000 gallons, the major oil spill. This is 7 major oil spills that we've collected since April of 2019.
How many years have you been doing this?
2 years.
The mouth of the Mississippi forms the heart of Louisiana commerce. This region is nourished by a mix of fish, water, gas, and oil. But increasingly, both the terrain and the economy are getting beaten up by Mother Nature. In 2004, Hurricane Ivan devastated the Gulf, including bringing down this massive oil platform operated by Taylor Energy. Cuvion made this video simulation of what likely happened.
To see the energy that it took to shear the legs of this 8-pile platform, the Taylor Energy platform, it's hard to comprehend.
The underwater mudslide toppled the oil platform, damaging the connections to as many as 28 oil wells below. To this day, the structure lies horizontally on the floor of the Gulf. The sheen caused by the oil spill spread for miles. For years, ships traveling through were coated in the slick. Pools of oil bubbled up to the surface, and marine life, like these schools of giant amberjack, had to swim through the muck. How could this spill have gone on for 17 years and counting without much public awareness? For one, Taylor Energy is not a Fortune 500 giant, but a local company, and a beloved one at that. For people not from here, who are the Taylors of Taylor Energy?
This is a family which has built its reputation as a benevolent community corporate citizen of the highest order.
Pat McShane is a prominent Louisiana maritime lawyer whose clients include Timmy Cuvion. He says that in New Orleans society, the Taylors are known for their educational philanthropy.
How you doing, man? I'm Pat Taylor. Nice to see you. How y'all been?
In 1989, 60 Minutes reported on the Taylors' generosity. When the spill occurred, locals assumed the Taylors would clean it up.
Taylor has been tasked under the Federal Oil Pollution Act with the responsibility for containing the oil and coming up with a permanent solution. And during that time, they worked hand in glove with the United States government.
The U.S. government makes money, billions in fact, leasing offshore oil rights. So when there is an oil spill, the government has ultimate authority. But we were surprised to learn how much the government relies on the leasing oil companies themselves to lead the recovery efforts. People might hear the story and say, wait a second, it's up to the oil companies to give the estimate how severe this is?
It is, and in general, the industry is very responsible in reporting those type of amounts and even cleaning up the spill and securing the source.
Captain Chrissy Luttrell, a veteran of the Coast Guard, was placed in charge of overseeing the Taylor Energy spill in 2018.
This is the biggest pollution response case I'll see in my 28-year career.
Taylor Energy was required by federal law to set aside $666 million in a trust to fund cleanup costs. Taylor says that by 2011, it had spent hundreds of millions to plug 9 of the most active wells at the site. Then, in 2013, Taylor Energy, along with U.S. government agencies, including the Coast Guard, issued this report, concluding the best option was to leave the underwater site alone. It said only small amounts of oil, about 3 gallons per day, were likely flowing, and further action could hurt the environment.
For years, they were claiming this was about 3 gallons a day, not 1,000, 3 gallons a day that was seeping out.
I honestly could not speak for their opinions on their science.
But measuring oil spills deep underwater is difficult, and estimates varied wildly depending on the source of the data. Captain Luttrell says that by 2018, the Coast Guard had access to improved sonar, revealing that oil was still escaping, a lot of it.
We believe there's multiple wells still leaking inside the erosional pit at the site.
At what point did you say, you know what, enough, the Coast Guard's going to take over this containment?
I came to that decision sometime in late summer of 2018. It didn't take me long to realize that we were going to go ahead and have to federalize this case when I didn't feel like I was getting a timely response out of the responsible party.
Luttrell says she was concerned that Taylor Energy was, in her words, not acting in a timely manner. And she took over control of the containment, putting out a call for bids for a temporary solution to collect any flowing oil. Timmy Couvillon's Louisiana firm competed with other engineering contractors to come up with an invention.
I'd worked with Timmy at Oceaneering.
Couvillon summoned 2 friends, former colleagues. They began with a basic concept: oil and water don't mix.
I had invented the underwater separator.
Jack Couch is a longtime expert deep sea diver. Dr. Kevin Kennelly, a.k.a. Dr. K, is an engineer. The 3 amigos, they called themselves, hunkered down in Timmy Couvillon's man cave in Belle Chasse, Louisiana, taking breaks only to shoot pool and eat po' boys.
Take me back to when you guys were using this room to solve problems.
Well, remember, Jack sat there, Timmy sat there, and I sat over here, and we each had a desk.
It took the 3 amigos 5 days before, as they put it, they went from can't to can.
There was even no moving parts. There's no pumps, no nothing. We just used the natural buoyancy of the fluids and stuff.
And I looked at them and I'm like, is there any reason why this won't work?
They even tested their invention in the backyard pool.
Well, we did everything from tested in a swimming pool to full-scale tests in very, very large tanks to make sure that it worked.
Against steep competition, their proposal was chosen by the Coast Guard in late 2018. The blue box would act like a cap which collects the leaking oil and gas that would get separated in the white tank, and then the oil would go to storage in the yellow tubes. From there, it would be pumped off to a ship each month. But Couvillon had to make the concept a reality, and the clock was ticking.
It was about December 15th. We were on site with our ROVs, which is a remotely operated vehicle, so an underwater robot.
Couvillon's team dropped the ROV to get detailed sonar images of what was going on 470 feet down. He says he was shocked by what he saw in his images. The red represents plumes of oil and gas spewing in front of the downed platform.
This is what you're seeing after you have the contract.
That's right. My first reaction was, this isn't micron droplets that's coming out from the seafloor. This is an underwater volcano.
Couvillon's crew put more than 200 tons of steel pieces together using enormous cranes, teams of expert sea divers, and multiple remote-operated vehicles. To get a sense of proportion, note the size of the men compared to the equipment.
I did not sleep very well those nights that I knew the divers were out and about on the seafloor in almost 500 feet of water, and I was concerned about the crane failing and that much weight dropping.
Spring of 2019 brought the moment of truth. This wasn't testing a simulation in a backyard pool. This was the real thing, a $43 million system in the Gulf.
When we opened up the valves, and less than a day later, the sheen had largely disappeared, we knew we had really done something. It was awesome.
Good day for the environment.
Oh, no doubt. Look, nobody wants oil in their backyard, right? We proved that we can clean up our mess, right?
You send it 500 feet down and dang, it's working.
It was simple, yet effective And I give the engineers credit for coming up with that design.
But like the muddy Mississippi itself, this tale has no clear endpoint. Taylor Energy headed straight to court. In total, it's filed more than 10 separate suits in conjunction with the oil spill, including one against Kuvion. The claim? He was trespassing and was negligent. Taylor's lawyer also told the court,
"We very much dispute that these activities need to be going out there at this point in time, or that this is even Taylor Energy oil out there at this point in time."
In response, Kuvion's maritime lawyer Pat McShane characterized Taylor's allegations as, quote, pernicious, and he pointed us to a wealth of evidence indicating that the oil was indeed Taylor's.
The National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, the United States Coast Guard have taken all manner of visual evidence of the plumes coming out of the seabed right at the platform. When you say that's not our oil against this overwhelming evidence, you're playing some different kind of game.
Kuvion, a former Louisiana State wrestling champion, says he's not backing down from the fight.
You're working to fix a problem that an oil company was responsible for, and now they're suing you.
Kind of crazy, isn't it? It's intimidation by litigation.
Taylor Energy also filed legal action against Captain Christy Luttrell, arguing that she overstepped her Coast Guard authority.
You've been named personally. How do you perceive this situation?
As the federal on-scene coordinator, I use my authority to do the right thing and to protect the environment.
Phyllis Taylor, CEO of Taylor Energy, declined our interview request. The company said in a statement that it has retained and relied upon the world's foremost experts to study and then recommend a plan of action. We continue to advocate for a response driven by science. Taylor lost its case against Kuvion and in action to recover the $432 million still left in that cleanup trust. 60 Minutes has learned that Taylor is now in mediation with the government to conclude all the outstanding litigation at once. Asked why he thinks Taylor resisted so intensely, Timmy Kuvion doesn't hesitate.
That's the $432 million question. You know, in this case, it seems like if you followed the money, you'd have a better chance of getting your answer.
What would you say to Phyllis Taylor if she were sitting right here?
I just want to know why. Why are we at this point? Someone that has given so much to our state, why would you continue to allow this oil spill to happen in our Gulf waters?
After our story first aired, Taylor Energy dissolved as a company, settling all remaining cases, agreeing to hand over $475 million to the federal government for cleanup and penalties. Kuvion's system is still plugging away. As of this spring, it's captured more than 1 million gallons of spilled oil.